So let me first thank the organizers for the invitation to comment on Torben's speech, which built, I guess, to a large extent on the previous report to långtidsutredningen. So I guess I will comment really on both. And I had expected that your emphasis would be slightly different, so I will sort of comment a bit more on some parts that you were not so explicit about, but which were very explicit in your early report. So the topic is the Nordic welfare state, the possibilities to combine equity and efficiency, and then efficiency defined as a high income level. And we could illustrate this in many ways. I don't have as sophisticated illustrations with regressions as Torben, but I have a few others. So this is one that I used a couple of years ago, shows the PPP adjusted income per capita, where you can see also the high income levels in the Nordic countries. And this is a picture of income equality, the Gini coefficient for disposable incomes of households, as Torben also had, where the Nordic countries then stand out very clearly for the big degree of equality. Now, one can often hear very simplistic arguments about the welfare states that claim that a generous welfare state with a large public sector, high taxes, are not just compatible with high incomes. So economies like the Nordic ones shouldn't really exist, but they do. So there's obviously something wrong with that argument. And I think that Torben did a very good job of explaining the problems with this simplistic argumentation, and you did a very good job in this report to långtidsutredningen too. And of course the obvious explanation, as you stressed here, is that the composition of both taxes and government expenditures, that does matter. So just to repeat what you said, that of course the impact of a tax increase depends on exactly what tax it is that is raised and what type of expenditure of expenditure increase that it finances. So if we have income taxes to finance sickness benefits, well, that is likely to reduce per capita income. If we have a real estate tax to finance daycare centers so parents can work, that in all probability increases per capita income. Of course, these are self-evident points, but still I think they can't be repeated too often, so I think it's good that you did that. And I think it is important. I like this distinction between active expenditures, which are growth enhancing, and passive expenditures, which do not have growth effects. And of course, the distinction between taxes that are more or less distortionary. Then of course, it's one thing to do this in theory, but it's much harder to classify expenditures in practice. I mean, in theory, all education, all investment in public infrastructure are growth enhancing. But we know that some education may be more consumption than investment. The falling PISA results, they signal that much schooling is inefficient. We know that labor market training programs often produce small or no returns. And we know that infrastructure programs can involve a lot of waste. I mean, think of Hallandsåsen or Botniabanan or the planned high-speed trains, to give just a few examples. But anyway, I like this graph that Torben had on the efficiency-equity trade-off. I think it's very pedagogical. I mean, it sounds very reasonable that we should have an initial interval when there is no efficiency loss from increasing equity. And of course, the easiest thing to think about is public education. Can certainly both enhance growth and produce a more egalitarian society by overcoming capital market imperfections that create economic barriers to education, but can also overcome social barriers, being a consequence of family background and so on. And it seems very reasonable then that after some point, you pass the hump in the curve. So we get the negatively sloped trade-off when marginal productivity, if we look at education, when marginal productivity has fallen and taxes to finance it are so high so that distortionary costs rise. I think it's also an important observation that if one looks at various countries, there is this strong positive correlation between the distribution of market incomes, that is before taxes and transfers, and the distribution of disposable incomes after taxes and transfers, which suggests then that an even distribution of skills, which in turn then depends on an even distribution of education, that is crucial for the distribution of disposable income. I think, take one of my own earlier graphs, Sweden is a good example of that. We have an equitable distribution of disposable income, but we do not stand out when it comes to how much redistribution we have through the tax and transfer system. Here, one can criticize it, but it's a measure that's sometimes used. You measure the redistribution by the tax transfer system, by the difference in the Gini coefficient between the Gini coefficient for household market incomes and the Gini coefficient for disposable income. I think that Torben didn't say that clearly now. I had expected you to be more clear about it, but you were very clear in your report along to utredningen. But I still take it, it's your view that we should use education as a main lever for promoting equality. I mean, that's a way of combining a welfare state of the Nordic Swedish case with efficiency. That's a way that we can get both equity and efficiency.
Lars, det verkar som att det är på bildspel.
Oh, so something happened.
Vi ska se.
So that's why we work. Yeah, I basically agree. I mean, with this view that education is, of course, the best income distribution policy. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. But there is a caveat that education and sort of taxes and transfers are not perfect substitutes when it comes to effects of income distribution. So I would say that even if one achieves the same effects on the Gini coefficient, there's still a difference. And the difference is that those that benefit the most from sort of more education are the most talented ones. So even if one can reduce aggregate income inequality through education, we still have the problem of income differentials between those that are more talented and those that are less talented, because it's the former that benefit the most from more education. So I mean, we still have one dimension left in the, which we could see as a problem when we talk about income equality. Now, I'll spend the rest of my time on commenting challenges to the welfare state. And we have often discussed skill-biased technological change, weakening the situation of the least skilled. And we discussed an aging population. So I will not focus on that. I will instead focus on the third challenge. And that's a challenge from large-scale immigration of low-skilled, mainly from outside Europe. And we know that a very substantial share of immigrants to Sweden, 40 to 50%, have very low education. It's maximum primary school or lower secondary school. That's grundskola as a maximum. These are the dark blue sections here in the statements. Lennart Flod and Joachim Rust also wrote a report to Långtidsutredningen, where they have a base alternative where a non-European immigrant gives a net present value cost for the public sector of 370,000 kronor. This is a population forecast from the SCB, Statistical Central Office, showing that there's a large projected inflow from low-income countries outside Europe. And what is done in this report by Flod and Rust is that they calculate primary fiscal balances for different population groups. And if you look there at the thick line, you see a deficit for non-European immigrants reaching sort of, it varies, but when it's a maximum, it's somewhere around 1% of GDP. Now, these calculations are, of course, extremely uncertain. They build on the assumption that employment patterns stay the same as today. They do imply substantial costs for non-European migration, but the costs are not huge. I mean, 1% of GDP is not a huge cost. But there is obviously extreme uncertainty regarding future migration. I mean, now migration flows have fallen drastically compared to last year, but we all know that it depends upon the extent of future conflicts, wars in the Middle East, in Africa, and so on. It depends on EU policies, it depends on the EU agreement with Turkey, which seems very fragile, and it depends upon our own policies. So certainly we must be aware that it's possible that flows of low-skilled immigrants could be much larger than according to the forecast. So I want to reflect a little bit on the consequences of this for the welfare state and for Torben's analysis. And of course the consequences, they depend crucially on what happens to employment. And in Flod Rust's report, there are alternative calculations with better employment outcomes, and then the costs of immigration are reduced, or they could even be turned around so that immigration of non-Europeans becomes profitable. But I think a problem with this type of calculations is that they just look at the alternative with better employment outcomes and neglect that we might need cost investment to get to these better results. But I guess we all agree that education efforts are needed for handling the migration problem. And we know that this is from the report of Arbetsmarknadsekonomiska rådet. We know that there are these big differences in reading, in proficiency in general, but here it's reading proficiency between persons with foreign and native background. And we know that these differences have increased over time. There was also, I think, a very interesting graph in last week's OECD report on labor market integration in Sweden, which points to larger returns in terms of improved employment outcomes from higher reading proficiency for foreign-borns than for native-borns, and larger in Sweden than in other countries. So I mean, this would speak in favor of the view that education is a good way of dealing also with the challenges to the welfare state from migration. But, and this is good news, but there are also problems that you can point to, and I would point to three. The first is that education investment is not a free lunch for today's taxpayers. I mean, it is a cost which has to be financed to a large extent by today's taxpayers. So even if it raises per capita income in the economy, when we include low-skilled immigrants in it, it likely lowers it for the population excluding these immigrants compared to the alternative if we did not have immigration. Or put differently, given that we have had the immigration, then education could be self-financing. But it's not self-financing compared to the alternative when we did not have the immigration. And of course, the largest costs, they arise if education efforts are financed by taxes with high distortionary costs, I mean taxes on labor. Lowest cost if we instead rely on higher real estate tax or higher consumption taxes, which we could get by moving back to a uniform VAT rate. But I would say that the hope for this is small, since it would require more courageous politicians than we have at present. It was different, of course, with Bengt Westerberg and Erik Åsbrink, but they are not in charge anymore. So some reason there for pessimism, at least in this respect. So that's, I think, that's one problem. It's not a free lunch to provide education. Then it's a question of the efficiency of the education sector. And we have we've had for a long time these huge difficulties of reversing the negative PISA trend. And I think this gives one reason to be skeptical about how good results the education sector can deliver when it has to be expanded a lot. So I guess that there are reasons to believe in rapidly decreasing marginal returns, not least because we have this shortage of teachers. Also in Swedish for immigrants, the SFI, but more generally we have that. And I think an interesting but disappointing parallel, that's a falling return that we had to labor market training in the 1990s, when those programs were expanded very much. And finally, perhaps that's the most sort of pessimistic part of it. So, suppose that even if education programs do become very successful in integrating migrants, there's still the risk that could be self-defeating, because successful such programs would of course strengthen the incentives for migration to Sweden by sort of raising expected incomes of coming here. So there's a risk that by succeeding better, sort of we could get even more migration, and then we're back to the problem where we have strains on the welfare state. Another possibility that could be to differentiate social benefits between those who have lived here for a long time and more recent immigrants. Something that's been done in Denmark. It's something that has been proposed by the moderates here. It is a way of holding down costs for migration and also, of course, to make migration less attractive. Some moral justification for it, in the sense that those who have not fully contributed to the financing of benefits perhaps should not have full access to them. But on the other hand, if we would introduce this principle, it would go against the principle of universality of the welfare state, universality for all those that are living here. So it would exacerbate income and social differences between those with a native background and those with a foreign background. So it would contradict traditional values behind the Swedish welfare state. Final possibility then, of course, general contraction of the welfare state with less generous benefits in general and less redistribution. And I say that I couldn't rule out that outcome either, in case we would get very large migration flows in the future and fail with the integration efforts. So, I will not try really to sum up and give any recommendations or clear conclusions, because I don't really know which they would be. And I don't want to be too alarmist either. I mean, if we go by existing forecasts, then refugee migration will have some costs, but the cost will be fairly small. They will be limited, they will be manageable. But I think we should also be prepared for a situation where migration flows could be so large that they could threaten the welfare state as we know it today. Because we will have these persistent differences in incomes and living conditions in general between parts of Europe or parts of the most advanced countries and many countries outside Europe. And if that happens, I mean, then I think we need to face very difficult choices when it comes to the welfare state and how to make that consistent with large migration flows. But as I said, I have no solutions. I just want to raise the problems. So I'll stop there. Thank you.